Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Thompson, and welcome to podcast number 1 of
Brain Software
with Dr. Mike Mandel. So, Mike, thanks for being here again.
Well, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me here. We're going to cover a lot of cool stuff over the next little while.
That's right. We did our first beta podcast, which I guess doesn't count as podcast number 1. That's podcast number 0. And we got a pretty good response, so we decided to go ahead and start doing an official regular podcast, probably every couple of weeks, maybe every 3 weeks.
Right, yep.
And we've got a lot to talk about. Obviously, Mike is an expert in a lot of things, so it'll be driven by whatever we want to talk about and whatever you guys want us to talk about. So why don't we start, Mike? Why don't we give people a little bit of a feeling for what kind of topics we might be able to go through in these?
Well, we have a lot of possible things to go into, Chris. As you know, my primary field of expertise is hypnosis. So we'll be looking at hypnosis a lot, all the ins and outs, talking about forensic hypnosis, self-hypnosis, hypnosis trainings, Ericksonian versus direct approaches, the works of people like George Estabrooks and Dave Ellman, and all these different things and what makes hypnosis so interesting after doing it since I was 12 years old, which is more years than I care to remember. And then we can look at NLP as well, neuro-linguistic programming, which, of course, you know, I'm a trainer. I teach for NLP Canada, although primarily hypnosis for them nowadays. The form of NLP we do, although I'm trained in both official schools, the classical NLP that some people call old code, but I think classical is a better name for it because it is classical. And the other, of course, is NLP New Code, which is the one created by Dr. John Grinder, one of my brilliant teachers, and we can look at some of the aspects of that. I'm hoping to even get into mentalism at some point in these podcasts, which will show people a lot of cool tricks of the mind you can do, freak out your friends and amaze your enemies, and pretty well whatever you feel like. And that's just the start. We're going to look at a wide variety of things, all tied in with the human mind, this remarkable thing we have in this bioelectric computer inside our head. The human brain is the most complex structure in the known universe. And as I've said before, we had in public school teachers who'd say, well, in a simple cell, we have, hey, there's no such thing as a simple cell. The most basic cell is more complex than New York City. And when your brain has billions of these, all interconnected through neural fibers and networks and so on, we have a fascinating, amazing structure to discuss, not the neuroscience so much as the information it contains, how we can change those states, change that information. So we will be looking at the elicitation and the transformation of subjective human experience, how we can affect our dreams and our very lives.
I think I'm in trance already.
Wide awake now.
Thank you. Well, then I think we should just get going and maybe touch on all of those subjects briefly, or the main headline subjects of hypnosis, NLP, new code, mentalism, maybe talk a little bit about influence and perhaps covert hypnosis, which ties along with it nicely.
Covert hypnosis, oh boy.
Yeah, so how about, why don't we get into hypnosis by having you tell us a little story about when you got into hypnosis when you were 12 years old, as you mentioned. What got you into hypnosis, and what was your first experience that made you realize that it is a real, valid science?
Well, that's a good one, Chris, because I wasn't expecting you to ask that, but there's those who are born into hypnosis. I guess their fathers were hypnotists. I think Dave Ellman's father did hypnosis. And there's others who aspire to be hypnotists, and then there's those who have hypnosis thrust upon them. And I fall firmly into the third category insofar as when we came to Canada from England, my father was concerned I was reading very few books and watching a heck of a lot of television, because back in those days there were only 2 TV channels in Britain, which shows how long ago it was. There was BBC and ITV. There wasn't BBC Canada or BBC US or any of those things. And when we came to Canada, to Toronto, my father wanted me to read more and took me to a bookstore and said, any book you want, you can have. They were avid readers, my parents, and got me to become one quite easily. I took to it, enjoyed it. But the book I saw in the bookstore that fascinated me was called The Key to Hypnotism by Walter Gibson. And I saw a copy just a few years back, bought it for a friend's son. And at age 12, took this book home and learned the contents. And one of the methods was hypnotizing difficult subjects. And back in those days, I assumed that everybody was a difficult subject with very little confidence as a 12-year-old boy. So began trying to hypnotize people, and trying is the correct word because I would by and large fail. Although next door there were 2 kids who were friends of mine, Max and Wayne. And I actually ran into Wayne a few years ago. I hadn't seen him since we were children. Max was a poor subject with my method I was using. Wayne was a phenomenal subject, and he was a couple of years younger than me, but I succeeded in getting him into such a profound trance that I was able to cause his hands to become numb enough to stick pins in his fingertips without him feeling it, an area that's normally quite rich in nerve endings and elicits a response with most people, certainly a young kid. And his parents found this far less interesting and less of a good idea than I did. And so I found a fascination with hypnosis at a very early age and continued with it through my high school years and so on, and then eventually made it the mainstay of my entire life, which is what it is now. Hypnosis to me is essentially the same as breathing.
So putting needles in pins in this kid's finger was essentially what convinced you it was real.
And it's terrible, isn't it? In fact, when I got in touch with Wayne a number of years ago, maybe 3-4 years ago, he showed up at one of my events at a theater demonstration I was doing, and I'd found him on the web. And I wound up talking to him on the phone first, and he said, "Hey, what are you doing these days?" He said, "I remember when we were kids, you used to hypnotize me and stick pins in my fingers." And I said, "Well, it's funny you should remember that, because you are essentially patient zero. You're the first one it started with." And then I told him I was doing hypnosis full time, and he was completely shocked.
Oh, that's hilarious. I remember I had a similar experience the first time I studied a little bit of hypnosis, and I managed to put a guy pretty deep under trance doing some crazy things, which I won't go into. But
come on, Chris. What did you do?
I had him running on a treadmill. It was in Porter Hall at Carleton University.
A non-existent treadmill.
Yeah, running on a non-existent treadmill, falling off the non-existent treadmill, and then...
And going to a non-existent hospital, I presume.
It cascaded into a bunch of other crazy stuff, and I ended up making the mistake of programming him to have complete amnesia for the entire experience of being hypnotized. So he thought he was just dreaming, and that I had woken him up in front of this large crowd. And I could not, still to this day, can't get him to believe that he actually did those things.
No, you'd have to get him back into the state, because we're talking about state-specific learning here. And it's wonderful that in one of your early attempts that you were able to produce a profound amnesia like that. Amnesia is an interesting thing. And state-specific learning, state-specific information is very key to a lot of hypnosis work. And when I say state-specific, I mean you have to be in the same state as when you took the information in, if it's a profoundly different state from your daily life, in order to re-access the information. For example, the drunk who loses his car keys can't find them anywhere, and the next time he's drunk, he remembers where he put them. And you had this guy in such a powerful state that unless you get him back in that state, he's probably not going to believe it again.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I really didn't know that much about what I was doing back in the day. I was probably 19 years old. I had only just started learning a little bit about this because I had seen your stage show, and I decided to start reading things like the collected papers of Milton Erickson.
Oh, Milton, yes.
Yeah, really interesting stuff, but I knew very little about what I was doing. This guy was just a phenomenal subject.
We all need phenomenal subjects in our early days. In the inchoate formation of our hypnotic careers, it really is encouraging. I don't know what would have happened if I had nothing but supposedly bad subjects for the first year.
Well, this is probably why there's so much documentation about hypnosis on how it only works on X% of the population. What do you think about that?
I mean, that's such a mythology, and so many theories about hypnosis are completely outdated. One of them being that very thing, that X number. I've heard some books say 10% of people are particularly good subjects, and maybe another 20% are mediocre, moderate subjects, and 30% are fairly good subjects, and the rest can't be hypnotized. And of course, all that is telling us is with that operator, that hypnotist, using that particular method on that day, that's the results he got on those people. It is so specific to the person, to the context. Hypnosis is entirely context-driven. I've created powerful hypnotic states with methods that should never have worked in a billion years, only because I didn't know they weren't supposed to work. I can remember taking people's names away on stage in my early 20s, and a hypnotist showed up at my event, and he said, "You can't cause that kind of amnesia without a deep hypnotic state." He was furious with me because I was breaking the rules.
What rules, right?
Right.
Way to redefine the rules. So speaking of stage hypnosis, though, it's very different than doing therapeutic hypnosis, right?
Very much so, right.
And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is if the literature says X% of people are great hypnotic subjects, maybe in a stage environment there's some more truth to that, because you're going to fire a specific method at a crowd and you're going to tend to get a certain percentage of people that respond very well. But in that case, you're having to throw one method at an entire audience. Is that not the way it works?
That's exactly correct. You have to use what typically a broad spectrum method that has a very high kill ratio, if you forgive the term kill ratio, because ideally, with a broad spectrum method, you're going to get a high enough percentage of good subjects that are going to be entertaining, because the number one outcome of a stage hypnosis show is it must be first and foremost entertaining. If it's not entertaining, you're not going to get hired back.
So that might be a good segue into NLP, because one of the things that I've noticed in watching you do the many stage hypnosis shows that I've seen is that you tend to use a fairly visual method of trance induction in the beginning. And I think from NLP, something like 60% of people are primarily visual thinkers.
In Western society.
Right.
Yeah, in Western society, one of the hallucinations or rules is that about 60% of us primarily use the visual system. But if you observe more closely, Chris, you'll quickly determine I'm using 3 different systems. So for those who aren't noticing it, yes, I'm doing trance by having them look at something, in this case, usually my hand doing an odd thing. But I'm also layering on all kinds of auditory cues that are firing off the Broca's speech center in the front left brain. So I'm using the auditory sense, and I'm also touching their hands and so on, setting up kinesthetic anchors that are going to fire these states later as well. So, but you're right. The primary thing that people are going to notice, from the audience at least, is the visual sense being activated.
And I think in classic direct method hypnosis, people tended to use, or still do tend to use, very visual focused trance inductions, right? Like Braid style.
Right,
inductions.
very, very well put. James Braid, of course, the doctor, some say optometrist from Scotland, some say Manchester, England, who was using a brightly colored or a lit up disc for his optometric patients to stare at, went out of the room, came back, and determined one had gone into a mesmeric state. And Braid then coined the term hypnosis, which means nervous sleep, and thought that it was eye fixation that caused it. Oh, you've got someone ringing you in the studio, Chris. We got a question coming in.
Must be a telemarketer.
It's a telemarketer phoning the studio as we speak.
All right, well, we'll just hang up on them.
So Braid was doing, yes, you're quite correct. Braid was doing very directive hypnosis based on a visual cue, having people focus their visual attention. But it's really, of course, not the focusing of the eyes that causes trance. It's the focusing of attention to a large degree, the shifting focus of attention.
Okay, so it sounds like Braid's method was entirely directive.
Yes, and that's classical, old-style hypnosis is cause and effect hypnosis. In other words, the hypnotist does something that causes the subject to go into a trance. But now we have adopted a different model, which is the Ericksonian or indirect model, although both of them are useful in context. This is what Dr. Stephen Gilligan called the cooperation principle in Ericksonian hypnosis. Basically, it's the idea that the hypnotist and the subject cooperate together, enter this communication loop that enables them to create trance between them. So it is the subject and the operator, or the subject and the hypnotist, work together to create trance rather than it being something the hypnotist does to the subject. And it's far more effective for that reason.
And so hypnosis is really about a hypnotist being in trance and being a coach to the subject.
Oh, that's a good one for hours of discussion. That's an interesting point, Chris. Yes, the question when I teach my students at University of Toronto for NLP Canada is, what trance are you going to be in when you're doing hypnosis? Because you will be in one.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, I've been your student for a long time, and I can attest to the fact that we just go in and out of trance all day long.
Wide awake now. You want to talk about any other aspects of
hypnosis?
Yeah.
I want to talk about content-free hypnosis therapy. So, as you invented the art gallery therapy, I think it's interesting to realize that as a hypnotist, you can help somebody without understanding the very personal details of the problem.
Or even knowing what they are.
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe talk a little bit about content-free.
Content-free therapy. Yeah, that's a really good point. Sometimes people will come in and they'll have difficulties, self-esteem issues, or they're going through all sorts of trauma, or they've been through trauma, and they don't want to talk about it because it's embarrassing and it's of a highly personal nature. And the advantage of a lot of these hypnotic procedures, some of which I created, enable us to work with the person content-free, so we have no idea of exactly what the problem is. We may not even have a clue, but we can still effectively deal with it because all we're actually doing is causing the person to access resource states. And the Mandel method of therapy basically says de-traumatize first. So whatever the person comes in for, you get rid of their trauma. You get rid of the problems, get rid of the things that are holding them back, the negative stuff, clear the slate, so now you can build in some resource states. You don't want to build a new house on the foundation of an outhouse. Get rid of the garbage first, then you can start fresh. So you're going to de-traumatize, build in resource states, and all of these things can be done completely content-free. You alluded to Art Gallery, which is a prime example of this. Therapists all over the place are using this method now, and I'm glad they are because it's so effective. I came up with it a number of years ago, and basically the technique is you pre-frame the concept of a big, beautiful art gallery up a flight of steps, a large building, museum-sized building. Put the person in even a light trance, for this will work very well, and then say, wherever you go, my voice will go with you, which of course is pure Milton Erickson, and then walk them through this art gallery, and they know in advance that they're going to be dealing with a particular problem, particular issue that they're going to call X or whatever, and you tell them they will see other people in the gallery perhaps. There may be paintings and drawings, there may be statues, there'll be all sorts of things to look at, but the other people will pay no attention to them, and they'll pay no attention to the other people, and this is alluding to a universal consciousness that we're all sharing at some unconscious level, and it seems to work very well. So the implication is there's other people in there for therapy as well. And so they walk through this wonderful gallery and they find the first drawing or first painting that is the problem. Now, to make it really quick for you, we take them through the problem. They look at it, absorb it all. They go into another gallery. They see the real problem. And this has freaked people out when they're looking at this, painting purely in their imagination, because now the unconscious mind will show them greater depths of understanding. And I've seen people burst into tears or shake or whatever when their unconscious shows them, oh, the problem isn't that your wife doesn't listen to you and your marriage is falling apart. The problem is you're an ignorant slob or whatever it is, right? The person is facing this for the first time. And then we take them on, though, to the third painting, which, of course, is the solution. And they stare at it and absorb everything from this third painting. And I flesh it out a lot more than I'm describing to you now. And then they come back and we leave the art gallery together, and all of this integrates beneath the surface and without ever knowing what the problem is. A lot of times, most times, we get a phenomenal solution developed from their unconscious mind.
And you don't even have to know anything about what they've
Not
gone
at all.
through,
Not at all.
Which is beautiful. It reminds me of a story of Milton Erickson, the father of Ericksonian hypnosis. I guess he didn't call it that at the time, but
no.
There was a story I remember where he was doing a demonstration with a woman who he had hypnotized many times before, and she was afraid of revealing personal information about her own situation, and he observed that she was particularly resistive on this occasion and that she didn't have her wedding ring on anymore. Remember, am I telling the story properly?
Yeah, it's sounding familiar.
And he took a piece of paper, twirled it up, wrapped it around his finger, and then dropped it onto the floor so that he would give her the unconscious message that, I know about your marriage breaking up, and it's safe. We won't talk about it. It was something to that effect.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Pure Milton. I mean, his stuff was amazing. And you're quite right. Milton Erickson did not do Ericksonian hypnosis. Milton Erickson just had conversations with people and talked to them and tranced them through the floor. It only became Ericksonian hypnosis when codified by people like Bandler and Grinder and a few others.
Who did an amazing job
Absolutely.
at modeling him, and Transformations, I think, is a fantastic
Excellent book. I remember John Grinder told me that he said they would go and sit with Milton for 3 days at a time, him and Richard Bandler, and take notes and learn and study and watch him doing his miracles, working with people. And they said that, I said, well, why 3 days? And John said, well, that's as long as you could stand to be in his presence, because you were just being zoned through the floor constantly. He was such a pixie and a joker.
So let's talk about conversational hypnosis, because I think from all the stories that I've heard, and I never had the pleasure of meeting Milton Erickson, that he was a master of trancing out an entire audience just through conversational speech.
Absolutely. And a lot of great orators do this without even knowing they're doing it. One of the foremost masters of controlling and swaying an audience is Fidel Castro. And I've heard stories of people standing in the rain. A reporter was standing in the rain watching Castro make a speech. And he looked at his watch, and 4 hours had passed, and he was still standing there and had just been swayed completely by the oratory. All good communication is hypnotic to some level.
So it's an interesting way of thinking, because hypnosis is something that happens naturally, and you may have a skill for influencing people without having been formally trained, or you might learn this skill. Right?
That's right. I was very fortunate insofar as I developed a lot of these Ericksonian patterns before I'd ever heard of Milton Erickson, back when I was young. And I remember when I studied NLP and began looking at Erickson's work, I thought, oh my goodness, this is that thing I do. It gave me a structure to understand what I had been doing sort of automatically. I remember walking home from high school many years ago with two friends of mine, and we'll call Brian and Steve only because that was their names. And we'd be walking home, and I would get them to fight with each other purely for my own amusement. And I'd talk to them in a certain way. And I'd begin accessing these angry states. And then I would step out of the frame, so they'd be just the two of them walking, and they'd look at each other as they were talking. They'd wind up, punching each other out on someone's lawn. I mean, I was a teenager at the time. Please forgive me, folks. It was a long time ago. And I remember Brian had Steve by the lapels. It got to the point they knew I was doing it, and it still would fire, and they wouldn't be able to stop it. And Steve saying to Brian, we don't have a problem. It's him. Can't you see? It's him. And Brian said, all I can see is that you're really annoying me. And they'd fight again. And it became what is known as context anchored, where if they walked home from school without me, it would still happen. Just by walking home the same route would fire the same states. Things are becoming anchored all the time.
I have a feeling you're keeping it family friendly, and you didn't really say you're annoying me.
Yeah, it was a little bit worse than that.
Oh, that's great. So we have covered quite a bit on hypnosis, and I'm sure at this point, if you're listening to our podcast episode number 1, you probably have some questions. So send us email. We would love to get your questions at info@MikeMandelHypnosis.com, or actually, I think we set up a separate email address, questions@MikeMandelHypnosis.com. So let's use that instead.
And that's Mandel with one L.
Yeah. Where else can we go? I mean, we can wrap it up in the next few minutes here.
I think we should mention that point, Chris, because you said the whole thing about covert hypnosis. You'd mentioned that to me earlier today. And I think one of the funniest examples happened to a friend of ours, Pep.
I love this story.
Pep is a good friend of ours. He's actually in our jiu-jitsu class. And one day, he and I came out of the Winchester Arms pub in Toronto, where the class tends to congregate after class jiu-jitsu on Wednesday nights. And we're all hanging out there. And it was pouring rain. And Pep had brought his umbrella with him, and he has a shaved head, so he doesn't want rain falling on his head. And he had this big umbrella in his hand. And just as we were walking out of the Winchester, he studied with me. He's a good hypnotist. But he said, I'd like to learn more about indirect or covert hypnosis. And as we walked out the pub, I started telling him a true story about my brother-in-law, whose sinuses were blocked when he was a little kid, who went to the chiropractor, who actually put a balloon in his sinuses to force them open and pop the balloon inside his head, which was not a fun experience. And as I'm showing him this, I'm demoing with my hands the sign of an umbrella opening up. And I said, but you don't have to do that. You really don't have to do that at all to have a good life. And Pep just sort of looked at me and nodded. And we stepped outside in the pouring rain, and I put my umbrella up, and he left his down. And we walked to the car, and he's hunched over with the rain bouncing off his head, and got the stuff out of the car and went back to the Winchester. And I suddenly said, you put your umbrella up. And he went, oh, what have you done? Like, he's totally freaked out.
So I think he realized what you had done only after the fact. So let's break that down a little bit. So he asked you about covert hypnosis. So the fact that you were going to talk about something wasn't going to be a foreign concept to him. He was expecting you to talk about hypnosis.
Right, but he wasn't expecting me to do it.
So you started telling him a story, and you used a gesture to anchor to the verbal command of, you don't have to do it. You can just leave it alone.
I made eye contact with him when I said that. And plus, I elicited I don't know how I do this stuff half the time, Chris. In all honesty, I just sort of do it and then can deconstruct it afterwards. And I think Erickson said much the same thing. He wasn't sure how he was doing it, but because it was happening unconsciously. But I know what I did was elicit a state we call curiosity, because curiosity is a state where all of our sensory channels are open wide, demanding information like vacuum cleaners. And by saying, well, it reminds me of my brother-in-law and his sinus problems as a kid. It's such a bizarre thing.
It makes you wonder, why would it remind you of that? And then, keeps
he
the
was all
curiosity
ears
channel open.
And talking about the sinuses being blocked and holding my hands up in a peaked form in front of me, like almost like a triangle with the fingers at the top, which is like the shape of an umbrella open. And saying, they were trying to open this, and I'm moving my elbows like this thing opening, but just anchored it all into the fact that wasn't necessary. And Pep's unconscious mind took it as not necessary to open the umbrella.
Now, when you're embedding commands and you're using stories to drop suggestions, you don't do it one time. You do it multiple times. You fire those commands.
Right. I like to hit things from different angles.
Right. And that's really the way it works.
Right. It's much covert work is done that way. Just simply approaching things from different angles, firing off anchored states. And we'll spend a lot of time on this on podcasts in the future and showing people how to influence your friends purely for your own amusement. I believe life should be effortless, enjoyable, and vaguely annoying to other people. I was kidding about the annoying part, of course.
So with that, I think we can wrap it up. We have been going for almost a half an hour on podcast number 1, and I think that's our ideal length of time.
Perfect.
And we'll just judge based on the feedback from our listeners. So I'm Chris Thompson. This is Dr. Mike Mandel.
Good to be here.
And this has been podcast episode number 1
of Brain Software
with Dr. Mike Mandel. Now, we're going to be dropping this show into the iTunes podcast directory, so hopefully you're already listening to it from there. If we could ask you a favor, it would be leave us feedback. It's really helpful in getting the word out about the show if there's reviews in the iTunes directory. So please leave your honest review and tell all your friends about the show if you enjoyed it. We really want to make this the most educational and entertaining NLP/hypnosis podcast on the planet. And send your questions to questions@MikeMandelHypnosis.com. There's one L in Mandel. And finally, if you're interested in checking out more about Mike's amazing self-improvement and self-hypnosis products, please visit us on the web at MikeMandelHypnosis.com.